Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, API Security, Insights, Trends, and Best Practices with Kite and Wib. Today, you'll be hearing from myself, Stuart Nairn-Clark, Business Development Director at Kite, and Chuck Herring, CTO over at Wib. Chuck will introduce himself later on as we go into his section. So in terms of the agenda, the need for API security, how it differs from traditional application security, the importance of comprehensive visibility, why a holistic approach to security is required, and then we'll touch on some API-specific compliance requirements. Let's bring you up to speed in terms of where we are today. Kite, as a business, we're reviewing the API space approaching 12 months ago. And we did some extensive research into the market, listening to what the analysts were saying. And it is very, very clear that the rise of API security and API attacks is prevalent. And here's just a few. I'll call out the one from Gartner. By 2022, API abuses will move from an infrequent to a most frequent attack vector, resulting in data breaches for enterprise web applications. And just a second one from Google. 50% of organizations have experienced an API security incident in the last 12 months. So it was clear that we needed to identify the space as part of our portfolio. Now, as when we review any type of technology, we reached out to some of our most trusted partners over at Kite to seek their feedback. Was this what they were all also hearing? But interestingly, we didn't just get feedback back, but we received opportunities back. It was clear that API security was a boardroom discussion, and that really accelerated our process in and around Wib and launching as we did back in January. I think what's also important to say, just before I hand over to Chuck, is that this was originally going to be a partner-facing webinar. But again, due to the awareness out there in the market, we also have a number of end users that wanted to join to see this content. So we have changed the content slightly, but any of the channel partners on here, we can follow up at a later date in terms of the channel specifics. Now, one of the things we wanted to do just before I hand over to Chuck is just to poll you guys. One, to see that you're listening, and also just to test it in terms of the knowledge. So what percentage of web traffic is API traffic? 26%, 44%, 72%, or 91%? We'll be back to you soon with the answer. And for now, I'm going to hand over to Chuck.
All right. Thank you very much. So today we're going to cover a number of things, and I'd like to show several pieces that are critical to really getting a company's arms around their API footprint, their ecosystem, and their security and risk. So as we go through, I'm going to make a few commitments today that we're going to get into. As far as myself, I am an American. Thank you for having me on this afternoon. I'll still try not to talk about myself too much, but Cliff's Notes is I've been doing this a long time. I was an attacker about 20 years ago, a penetration tester for several years. And then I switched to the blue team, the defender. I was a CISO for 18, almost 19 years at companies like Texas Capital Bank, AIG Consumer, and others. And it was really in the banking space and building a digital bank where I realized that the methods and technology stack that I had been using for the last, over a decade was no longer sufficient for the attack surface that we were exposing. Everything in modern fintech digital banking is API driven, and it's not just in banking; it's all across the industry. The adoption of APIs is so powerful that it's inevitable. But when we change our architecture, we change our attack surface, and our defenses have to evolve. This is just the latest in a series of adoption of new technologies with security and risk lagging behind it. We as humans do this all the time. That's what we're going to talk about today. So today is not designed to be a product demo. We're not going to talk much about our specific product. I'm not going to walk you through our screens or anything. We can do that at a later date if any of you have interest, and I'm happy to do it. But I do want to go ahead and drag into what are we going to cover today. So what I'd like to communicate to you all today is, let's by the way, let's keep questions to the end if we can, and we'll be happy to collect them, and then we'll try to answer them in series as we go. So for today, I want to share what we are seeing in the field now after having been in the field and working with companies all over the world. What are the 4 biggest problems that we typically see when we engage with a new company and a new firm? Why is API security different? How is it different? Those are important things to understand. We don't need to get into the bits and bytes and super technical details, but just understanding of the concepts is very important. And then we're going to walk through a real-world case study of an attack on business logic to make the abstract more concrete. So I want to give an example of an actual attack on business logic that we perpetrated in this case with one of our banking customers, and show how even mature organizations that have a legacy stack that were geared towards the OWASP top 10 for web that we've been using for the last 20 years, literally since 2003, and why all of these things aren't covered when you start looking at APIs. We're going to give you a list of questions that you can use to self-assess either yourself or your customers and partners on the relative maturity of their API, security and risk management. And spoiler alert, I actually developed this list of questions in my conversations with regulators here in the US for OCC, the FDIC, and Farm Credit, which is an insurance regulator, as they were seeking our advice at an event for how should we be thinking about this from a regulatory perspective. So the regulators are catching up, and we're working with them to try to help them understand the right questions to ask. I'm going to give you those questions. And we're going to learn why a defense informed by the offense is the only way to address API security. You really have to take the attacker's view into account when you start trying to secure your APIs. And how do you catch up and keep up? So these are the things we're going to cover. And so I'm just going to dive right in. What are the biggest problems that we run into? Biggest problems that we see are ownership. Who owns API security for your company? Do they know it? This is something where there's a lot of this. A lot of times the development staff or dev team says, I assume security does, and security tends to say, I don't know, it's a development thing. And if there's no ownership, then there's no plan, there's no strategy. So this is where we start. Now, just having ownership doesn't necessarily mean that you solve the problems, but if you don't have a champion, if you don't have a point person that understands that this is their area of responsibility, or a team that has shared responsibility in sort of a racy view, then that's the place to start. Whose problem is this? And it can't be somebody like the CEO, right? It needs to be an actual owner with some day-to-day skin in the game. The second challenge that we have is visibility. Once we have ownership, you can have ownership without visibility, but you can't protect what you can't see. So when you look at any of the major standards frameworks, whether it's NIST or the critical security controls or anything, they typically start with asset inventory. APIs are no different. The I in API is interface. You need to know what all of your interfaces are. You need to know the interfaces that you're exposing to partners, to mobile apps, your web apps, to the outside world. If you don't have this visibility, you can't protect what you can't see. That's why NIST and other frameworks start with identify before they go to protect, detect, respond, recover, and so forth. Once you start getting the visibility, you will need tooling that can help you understand the risks and protect against logic-based attacks. Most current tooling like WAFs and API gateways were just never designed for this type of attack. And we're going to show you how that works and actually show you an example of a real API attack where we attacked business logic and it went directly through one of the top WAFs that this bank had in operation. And then keeping up. We are never going to go back to the days as a species of quarterly releases and manual pen tests before every release. We have got to keep up as security practitioners with the velocity of development. So how do you catch up and keep up when you have systems and applications that change multiple times per month, multiple times per week, many times multiple times per day? How do you keep up with that? You have to automate it. There's no manual way to cover these things. So how are we on the poll? Do we have the poll answers yet? Or should we come back to that later?
Let's come back to that later, Chuck.
All right. Let's go back to it later. So let's talk about why and how API security is different. Fundamentally, the architecture is different. When we changed our applications from this monolithic design, monolithic architecture, we changed the security model, we changed the attack surface, and therefore the attackers are modifying their attacks as well. So the way that we attack APIs is there's a Venn diagram with overlap for traditional web apps. Things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, they still work against API endpoints, and we see them a lot. But there are novel attack types that we are not used to dealing with normal web apps that are available to be exploited via APIs. And attackers have figured this out. And therefore, our defenses have to evolve. Our defenses need to be different. So when you think of these architectural changes, just one easy way to think about it is if you think of a monolithic application or a monolithic stack, you have a couple of ways in, a couple of ways out, internal services that are working together. They're largely trusted, and it's relatively easy to protect from an information security perspective. Maybe a physical analogy would be something like a castle and a moat, and you put a couple of guards out in front of the drawbridge with halberds or spears or whatever, and everybody inside the castle is protected. Well, the attack surface for a modern API-based, microservice-based architecture and ecosystem is more like something like a strip mall with doors on the outside of every store than a castle and a moat. And each of these doors has access to the cash register inside each store, as well as access into the back end of the shopping mall. So if we don't change our approach to defense, we still have a couple of guys standing out in front of the main entrance to the mall, but all of these access points, all of these interfaces, and all of these services are opening ways into the back-end systems and data in ways that we didn't necessarily anticipate. These are the types of things that we find the external surfaces, and I'll talk about mapping your external attack surface from the outside and simulating what a skilled attacker looks like and how we do that a little bit later. But fundamentally, when you change your architecture, you change your attack surface, and your defense has to evolve. Here we quote a couple of industry sources, OWASP and our friends at Contrast. WAFs were built to protect your web apps, but they don't protect against logic-based attacks. Your WAFs simply don't understand your business logic. They don't understand what's happening at the code level. They don't understand how the various components that are inline necessarily impact things on the way back. They know to look for things that are obviously malicious, header-based attacks, SQL injection, things like this. But when we get into the OWASP API top 10, which, by the way, if you haven't looked at that yet, there is a different OWASP top 10 list than the web top 10. The OWASP API top 10 was first published in 2019, and then the industry, upgraded that in 2023 with this list of top 10 issues. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list of everything that can go wrong with your APIs. It's just the top 10. So you get that Pareto principle of 80%, of the vulnerabilities are covered with the short list. And what we see are a lot of issues with authorization, authentication, ways that attackers are able to impersonate other users, assume their privilege, and failure to scope resources and limit access to resources are the common things that we see in APIs. Many times, these are very difficult to detect because the detective mechanisms that we have in place were never set up to do that, and they don't understand this. So many times, you'll see an API attack from a forensics perspective, and when you look in the WAF logs, what you'll see is a request and then a response, 200 OK. It was a legitimate request, a legitimate response, and you're left with the question, what was the hack here? And there's a pretty good chance it was a business logic attack. Regulators and governing bodies are catching up. So any of your customers, or if you directly are covered under something, say like PCI, we have a couple of quotes here from PCI. We'll go into a little bit more detail in a second. I'm not going to read the whole standard to you, but the new PCI DSS version 4, which now everybody that stores, processes, transmits, interacts with credit card data has to move towards by Q1 of 2025, specifically calls out API as an attack vector and an area that requires specific focus. And I'm going to show you in the new standard exactly where those are so that you can talk with your customers, or you can talk with your internal stakeholders about, hey, how are we covering for this? Because you will need to address API security as part of development, testing, production monitoring, and penetration testing to maintain your PCI compliance with version 4. And I'm going to show you where those pieces are if you're not a super nerd like me that actually reads the 200 pages of the standards here. So the regulators and other governing bodies are catching up. And with the new requirements, especially in the US now around SEC disclosure, it's going to be very important for companies to exercise their due care and be able to demonstrate that they're exercising their due diligence and due care about their attack surface. If their attack surfaces include APIs, these stakeholders are going to have an expectation that these things are covered and overall as part of the enterprise security program. What we find is that is not often the case today. This is a very common blind spot that many programs have not adequately taken into account. So when we get to the questions, I'll show you where you can start with the most basic questions and go to the very advanced questions in a second for an assessment perspective. But I'm not going to read all of these to you. This is obviously a lot of text. I highlighted the really key sections here that I wanted to call out. So if you're taking notes or taking screenshots, the main sections for PCI DSS 4 that speak to API specifically, section 6.2.4. And this is the section that scopes in the types of attacks that PCI compliant organizations must take into account as part of their threat model and their security program. Specifically now calling out that attacks on business logic, including attempts to abuse or bypass features and functionalities through manipulations of APIs, that is directly out of the PCI standard, section 6.2.4. So anyone that you're working with that needs to comply must have this as part of their security program. The next is 6.4.2. This and the penetration testing section that we're going to talk about in a second both hark back to 6.2.4. So your runtime monitoring and blocking must cover the same attack and vulnerability types that are covered in that earlier section. So for public-facing web apps, you need an automated technical solution that continually detects and prevents web-based attacks and must cover logic-based attacks as defined in that earlier section. And when it comes to penetration testing, regardless of what any vendor tells you, automated penetration testing is not real and is not acceptable for a QSA to get your attestation or report on compliance. So your penetration testing must cover APIs if they are in use in your environment to and from your CDE and so forth. So application layer penetration testing must include these vulnerabilities listed in 6.2.4. So these pieces are straight out of the PCI standard. I want to make sure that you have line of sight into these so you understand as companies are coming into compliance in 2024, which is about 40 minutes from now, you have to address these things as part of the assessment for PCI. So how are we going to get a handle on where we are? Here are the questions that we've created for customers, for partners, and for regulators to start understanding and asking, how is a company addressing API security? These are some things that you can use. Number one starts at the beginning, ownership. Whose ownership is this? Is it the CISO? And if the organization has a CISO, if it's the CISO, if that's your answer, second question is, do they know it? Do they know it, and are they taking steps to understand it? Chances are they don't. And there's a lot of history of CISOs and security operations teams not necessarily working hand in glove with development teams on making sure that new attack vectors are adequately covered during the development and release process. So we have to start with ownership. And as you go through these questions, and you can read these at your leisure, they get harder and harder and harder. And down at the bottom, I created one that actually shows what I would consider to be a good operational metric. So what is the average response time in minutes when a Ebola attack is detected against one of our production APIs? That is the kind of metric that I would create as a CISO that mandates that you have to know your inventory, you have to know your vulnerabilities, you have to know when you're being attacked, you have to have workflow that assigns that to someone to do something about it, and you need to measure your response time, and that is a measure of operating effectiveness. Very, very, very few companies today are at that level of maturity when it comes to their APIs. And we are all going to need to get there in the next couple of years. There's a tremendous opportunity here, and there's also a tremendous risk here. When we think of critical infrastructure, and in particular financial services, lots of areas have a lot of attacks surface that's exposed that they don't necessarily know. We'll talk about some specific examples in a bit. So here we're going to go into our case study. I would like to hit the poll before we get into this so we don't lose track. What percentage of web traffic is API traffic? The answer to that is 91%. 9 out of 10 packets going across the internet today are coming to and or from an API of some sort. We learned this when we were presenting at a conference about a year and a half ago. And this is a stat from Akamai. And the stat at the time was 83% of web traffic. And afterwards, one of our partners from Akamai came up to us and said, hey, your stats are wrong. And I was mortified as a presenter because like we take the integrity of our data really seriously. And I said, what do you mean? He said, yeah, we just redid that study. It's now 91%. So it went from 83 to 91% in the several months between when they had published that stat and now. So adoption is not slowing down. Adoption is increasing. So how are we going to get our arms around it? I'm going to go through a case study now of a real bank, a real customer of ours. This is about a just under $100 billion bank. I'm keeping it vague so that people don't try to reverse engineer who it might be. It is not a U.S. bank. The regulators I was speaking of earlier specifically asked, what bank is this? And I said, it's not your jurisdiction. It's not a U.S. bank. But if it was, it would be in the top 50. So it's a sizable organization, about 100 years old. And then they had a mature security program. They've been doing this for a long time. But I want to show you what an attack on business logic looks like in the context of something like banking. In this case, money movement and currency conversion. So with a live account, we found that we were able to execute a classic salami slicing attack. And if that sounds familiar, it should. We as defenders have known about these types of attacks for decades. If you remember Superman 3, for example, that was the plot. Richard Pryor, driving up in the Ferrari. That was 40 years ago. That was 1983. It was also the plot to Office Space when Milton set the building on fire. We have known about salami slicing attacks in banking for a long time. And our threat models as the CISO for a bank included these types of attacks. But what happens sometimes is when you change the architecture, you don't necessarily know where all of the controls are being executed, and they can be vulnerable to tampering, which is what I'm going to show you how we did. So in this case, when it came to moving money around, either money transfers back and forth or currency conversions from pounds to dollars or yen to shekels or whatever, there are specific controls that were put in place to protect the bank. Now, what we found is that if you go through the normal interfaces that the bank is expecting you to use, like the mobile app or the web app, many of these controls are actually front-end controls, and users can tamper or bypass them. This is a pretty common architectural problem in the security space, and I'll show you how we exploit it. So for each of these transfers, in this case, there are minimums that the bank set on the mobile app and the web app. So you can't just convert $1 to €1. It needs to be in an order of 100 of whatever the base currency is. This imposes a specific cost on money transfers as a security mechanism and as a profit generating mechanism for the bank. The bank likes two things. They like to be secure and they like fee income. The second thing is that fee. They enforce fees on currency conversions, which varies by the currency pair that you're using, but it's not free. So if you convert $100 to 100 euros or 100 pounds to 100 yen, there's going to be a fee for that. And as a result of that fee income, they chose as a design practice, if you look at number 3, maximum number of daily transactions, they did not put a rate limit on this because each one of these conversions generated a fee. And what do banks love? Fee income. That was a conscious design choice. We were able to exploit that. And then actually the business logic that we hack is down here in the currency rounding. And I'm going to show you how that works. So we have these controls. When we go around the interface they expect us to use, and we don't submit our requests through the web app or the mobile app, but we actually go directly to the backend API, we're able to bypass these controls. And here's what we did. So when you see here, we got to charge a conversion fee for conversion via the mobile app. Then when we did it directly via the API, we were charged no fee. We were able to eliminate that. Conversions are rounded. This is a very important way that business logic works. So banking cores typically calculate to 5 digits past the decimal. So when you convert $1 to €1, you'll get $0.92292 or euros. And then the business logic rounds to the nearest penny before it's deposited and settled into your account. Banks do this because when you start calculating very large interest amounts and things like that, those digits add up over time. So there's business logic that we all know that works in banking systems to round up or down based on settlement to the nearest penny. Now, that's important because what we can do is when we remove the minimum amounts of conversions that we're able to conduct, we can find a currency pair and exploit that rounding logic. So what we need is something that's going to be just over the rounding point. So here the Australian dollar is pretty close, but if you convert to a dollar to an Australian dollar, it's going to round down. If we go to Canadian dollars, though, here's a good match for us. So if you convert £1 sterling, you get 1.55. If you sell a pound sterling, you get 1.55 Canadian dollars, or more specifically for the purposes of our attack, if you sell 100th of a pound or a pence, then you get 0.155 Canadian dollars, which rounds up to 2. So in this case, you sell 1, you get 2. You sell 1, you get 2. Now, as we're going through, I'm going to show you what this looks like. Keep in mind, the question I'm going to come back to is, what's the hack here? Valid username, valid password, valid request to the API. The API responds exactly as it was designed to do. The business logic rounds exactly as it's designed to do, but we are going to steal money. And this is what it looks like. So, of course, we had to be cute with it as we're showing the customer. We say, do you want to print money? The answer to that is, of course, if you're the Federal Reserve or a private citizen, the answer is always yes, you want to print money. So we're going to print money. Now we have to enter in the session cookie because that's got our token, valid username, valid password, valid token. And now we are going to request the balance, which we're completely authorized to do as a normal user. This is not an admin account. This is a regular checking account user. We pull our balance and we start selling off a penny at a time. So obviously this is automated attack, and we are selling off a penny at a time. And we started with 10,000 pounds and we wound up with 20,000 Canadian dollars. Now at this point, we've run out of money to sell. So we've successfully abused the business logic. We've increased our cash on hand, but if we want more, remember we made conversions free. So we're just going to convert it back, and then we're going to sell it again and go from 10,000 to 20,000, 20,000 to 40,000, so forth and so on. And we did this for a little while, and we only ran it for about a half an hour because we didn't want to cause a real issue, at the bank, a real accounting issue. But you can do this essentially an unlimited amount of times. As we were doing the forensics for this, we saw these requests and responses come through the WAF, come through the firewall. It's one of the leading firewall products. And as I said earlier, the request and response is just 200 OK. It's a legitimate operation. So I ask again, what's the hack here? This is what I mean when I say that our legacy security programs are not necessarily designed to pick up these types of attacks. The WAF doesn't understand what's happening. The way that we actually would have detected this, I'll get into in just a second on the next screen. This is our celebration with our head of research, Zach. It was a good day for him. We had a good weekend. When we went into this customer and we said, okay, this is what we did as part of this simulated attack, we went through the scenario of, okay, did you see us? Did you detect any of this? And the answer in this case was no. They didn't see anything suspicious, anything untoward. They had an entire internal penetration testing team, 16 people that were red team that had not thought about this attack vector. They didn't have any testing for this vector. Change management process didn't detect that this had become open as an attack surface. The 24-hour security operations functions didn't see anything, and so forth and so on. So we said, well, when would you have found this? And they said, let's find out. Well, give us a couple of days. Came back a couple of days later and said, okay, here's what we figured out. When we do these when we hold money in these accounts for currency conversions or money movement, if we run out of money in one of those accounts, we have to go buy and replenish our stock of, in this case, British pounds, just like anybody else does. When we get to a certain threshold, we know we have to go back to the open market to buy more of this currency. At that point, we do a look back analysis to understand how much profit did we make. At that point, we should have seen that we didn't generate the fee income that we expected, because remember, we removed the fees from the transactions. We should have seen that we didn't get the revenue that we expected in terms of fee income, and that would have tipped us off that something was wrong. We said, okay, well, when would that have been? It would have been about $10 million. At about $10 million worth of losses here, we might have gotten an indication via a manual look-back process. And in this case and all our other cases, it was simply a blind spot. They did not think about how we could abuse the business logic that's made available to regular users day in and day out for this type of money movement. This type of attack can potentially go on for a long, long time without detection until some manual reconciliation process, or more likely when the attacker actually trips an egress control, like trying to move too much stolen money out, over $10,000 or over $2,500, whatever the bank's policy is. But actually seeing this attack in real time is not likely unless you're actually instrumented for it. And instrumenting for this type of attack is exactly what we do. This is the type of scenario that we focus on, not just for banking, but for other industries as well. So these blind spots are fixable. It's not all gloom and doom. It's just we need to acknowledge that the attack surfaces are different than they used to be. And the traditional defense, even against attack types that we've known for 40 years, are still out there. So here in this case, we should have seen several issues if we had a holistic approach looking for API security. We should have seen, for example, in their source code that there was no rate limiting, there was no pagination, there was no limit on the number of transactions, and identified that as a flaw. We should have seen that from a production traffic monitoring perspective, we had an unusual burst in traffic coming from one source using one token. That suddenly did a couple of 100 million of transactions, and those transactions themselves looked different from the normal request to the API, because normally when the request came from the mobile app to the backend system, it would say, convert this amount from this currency to this currency, deposit into this account, charge this fee, which varies by the currency pairing, and charge this fee and put the money in your account. We removed several of those key controls, so the requests themselves actually look different. If you had a baseline for what normal traffic looked like, you should have seen a flag when that type of thing happened. But because they were not specifically instrumented for it, they did not see it, and many others would not as well. Now, this is a case study. We have more of these. I'm not going to walk through more of these, but there's sometimes we get a question and people say things like, well, we're more worried about ransomware right now. It's an absolutely valid thing that you should be worried about. In this particular case, we took one subdomain, one of 35, less than 3% of their attack surface. We were able to leverage a cross-site scripting vulnerability on an API endpoint to elevate our privilege to publisher for this business application. We then were able to leverage that access to host malware on a government server. Then we escalated our privilege yet again via another persistent cross-site scripting vulnerability on another API and locked the other admins out. At the same time, we enumerated all of their users via a third API endpoint and set the stage for a large ransomware attack. So we have all your admins locked out. We are hosting malware on government systems, and we have all of your users. The next step would have been a massive ransomware attack for this agency. These interfaces are attack vectors for many, many different types of attacks. So I encourage teams and defenders not to think in terms of either or. What an attacker does once they have illicit access is really up to that attacker. How do they want to monetize that access? Or are they a hacktivist? Are they trying to push geopolitical goals? For example, in the current war that's going on in the Middle East, an early warning system was just hacked via an API weakness that caused a lot of false alarms to go out. And this was an API hack. We saw this happen in real time. These attacks can manifest themselves for all kinds of different means and ends, depending on what the attacker is looking to do. So we will publish, and happy to go through any of these other case studies. We have a lot of them that we've learned, a lot of lessons learned, and all of these lessons go directly into our product as well as our practices. So as we continue to learn, our product and our approaches continue to evolve. So we'll share these and happy to dig into any of these if there are any specific verticals or industries or regions that your company wants to focus on. We probably have case studies that are relevant for that we can use for your constituency and your partners. But that is really the bulk of what we wanted to cover today. We need to, as an industry, we really need to escalate the visibility and awareness of these types of attacks and these types of vulnerabilities in APIs. The adoption has already happened. APIs are already 91% of web traffic, and our security program must evolve. And ideally, we will evolve these things for our customers before the regulators mandate it. But that is coming as well. That's providing a very, very large opportunity for us as an industry in the next couple of years. and we're happy to be a part of it, and we're glad that you're a part of it as well. So if you're customers, if you need a hand, we're here to help. And with that, that is the end of my materials. Let me turn the mic back over to Stuart for wrap up and questions.
Thank you very much, Chuck. That was excellent as always. So we have got a couple of questions, and if there are any other questions, please do raise your hand or put into the chat. But the first one was, so, okay, you've talked about how traditional methods are no longer sufficient, but how does Wib differentiate itself from other API solutions on the market? And I guess over the 45 minutes, we've talked about different user cases and scenarios, but I guess if we were going to deliver the elevator pitch, and for me, Chuck, I think that's one of the biggest reasons we did this, is because there is a lot of confusion in the space in terms of actually what is required. So yeah, how would you sum it up?
It's a great question, and I'll never speak ill of our competitors. We're all working on solving hard problems, but what we learned from our competitors as they brought their solutions to market was that, generally speaking, that most of the competition takes a very traffic-centered approach, really monitoring production traffic. And what we at Wib view is that traffic lens is a useful lens, but it is an insufficient lens. It does not give you enough context to really understand what you're actually vulnerable to. So you can, for example, generate API documentation by only monitoring production traffic. The trick, though, is the problem, though, is you can only document things that are actively in use. Zombie APIs expose attack surface to the outside. This is a big problem, but they're not necessarily in use, or at least not regularly. So a non-technical example would be, imagine that your job was to inventory all the ingredients in a kitchen for possible food allergies, which is a very, very serious problem for a restaurant. But the way you chose to do that was station somebody outside the kitchen and watch every plate that comes in and out. That won't tell you what ingredients are actually in the kitchen. That won't tell you what's in the freezer. It will tell you what's selling. It will tell you what's active. But that is not going to really help you understand what's actually in there. That's why our approach takes the traffic lens and we augment that by examining source code and performing static and dynamic testing on the way through, because we feel that the production lens is the last line of defense, not the first line of defense. We want to find these issues well before production in lower environments, and you can only do that if you have additional lenses for development and testing. The traffic-based approaches is just limited. Like there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not sufficient, and you wind up with a lot of false positives and a lot of blind spots. That's a very hard problem to solve in API security.
Thank you very much, Chuck. And I guess another question has come through, and you touched on it just in your answer there, but I'll read it out anyway. Should a customer deploy the platform solution as well as pen testing? Can you have one or the other? Can you explain?
Great question. It's a very astute question, because they're not the same thing. They are designed to be complementary. But yes, you can absolutely have one or the other. For example, you can just do pen testing. And in some cases, we have pen test only customers. In some cases that we're working with a CISO or defender that doesn't really know if they have a lot of exposure to the outside. So it's a way for that customer to engage with professional attackers like we are, and validate that either, yes, we have a real issue that I need to invest resources into, or maybe they don't have an issue. Maybe they don't use a lot of APIs for that particular company, and it'd be a waste of resources to do it. So it's kind of a no-lose situation for the customer. You either get a good insight for what your actual attack surface is, and you can manage that appropriately, in which case the CISO or whoever we're contracting with looks very proactive, or they get a clean bill of health that, yeah, you really don't have a lot of risk exposed via this to the outside, and good on you for asking, right? Either way, it's a good outcome. Now, once we package the platform and the pen test together, this is something that we do fairly commonly. When we package the pen test service and this platform together, the recurring penetration tests get very short in duration, very easy, and very accurate because they become super white box. If you're familiar with pen testing, there's a black box approach where the testers don't really have any insight, gray box where they have some insight, and a white box. Once we have the platform up and running and actually monitoring an API ecosystem, we're able to do these creative manual pen test exercises on a quarterly or semi-annual basis or something, but the testers have all of that information at their fingertips. So the assurance level that we've actually found all of the exploitable issues to the outside becomes very high because of the level of visibility that we all have. But you do not have to do it all together. If budget or whatever constraints, we can separate them, but they're meant to work together.
Perfect. And Chuck, again, I think your answer there has just sparked another question. So I'm going to take this one. How does API pen testing differ to third-party API pen testers?
I'm not sure I quite understand. Do you mean testing third-party APIs or a third party doing the testing?
So how does Wib's API pen testing differ to other third-party API pen testers? So I guess yeah.
Yeah, so a couple ways. One, with the visibility that we have, we're able to conduct pretty inexpensive and very accurate pen tests when the platform is running. That's a big differentiator as opposed to a regular pen tester just coming in from the outside. But there's a substantial gap in skill set among pen testers that don't really know how to test for API vulnerabilities. They exercise APIs typically when they test a mobile app, for example. If that mobile app is using the mobile app is using APIs on the back end, they will typically exercise those in the scope or a scope of a web app pen test, but they don't unless that's specifically scoped in by the customer. And that pen testing company has specific API pen testing expertise, which many do not. And we support multiple pen test companies and augment their API skill set. Many times you get a false sense of confidence that your APIs were actually tested when in fact they were just used. You weren't looking for specific API vulnerabilities. One of our customers in the EU, actually, we followed a pen test by about 3 weeks, and we found multiple instances of vulnerabilities going back to 2007 and several instances of Log4j that were still exposed that their pen testers had missed because they weren't looking for those types of things in the APIs, that they were just testing the web app, not the APIs behind them.
Understood completely. So let's change it up a little. So a question that has come in is, where does the platform reside?
So we typically it's a SaaS platform, and we have a Lasso server in your environment. So we have a little footprint in your environment that helps with traffic collection as well as connecting with a read-only account to code repos. The backend sits in our environment, and that's where we do our number crunching. We are passive and not inline by design, which means that we introduce no latency, no single points of failure. If the Wib system goes down or whatever, it doesn't impact your production processing at all. But we do our analytics on our back end. And for example, if you are covered by PCI, we will take and actually obfuscate, mask the data before it ever comes into our environment because we have no interest in expanding your PCI scope. We need to know that there is a credit card number, but things like, the full PAN are hashed and obfuscated before sent to our backend for processing and running our models against it for anomalous traffic, attack behavior, things like that.
Perfect. And this question's coming in. Genuinely, it's a question I've got myself. So many of the issues and measures you mentioned are designed for large corporations with many dev and pen testing teams, etc. Would your recommendations be different for small companies and startups with maybe one person in the IT team, etc., etc.?
It's a great question, and definitely the size and scale of an organization and their organizational structure is absolutely material in the recommendations that we would provide for that customer. Many times we find that the large environments, while they do have more resources, they also have a lot more complexity. Small environments tend to have slightly different needs with respect to they need force multipliers, that they need ready visibility and context at their fingertips because they simply don't have enough resources to run all these things down, which makes it even more important to use a partner like Wib that can actually flesh out the false positives and get you to the actionable intel. Our goal for every alert, whether you're a 100,000 person company or a 10-person company, is any alert that we provide, we want to have what, so what, and now what, so that you're able to actually allocate resources intelligently. We find that to be very important for small teams But the small teams tend to be nimble and able to actually address these issues pretty quickly, whereas the larger teams there's a lot more organizational considerations for how you have to send it to different groups and different teams and different geographies. They have different challenges. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but the same concepts exist for everybody. Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. You have to do these things on purpose. But there's definitely a bit of tailoring that's appropriate for the customer, their architecture, and their organization.
Perfect. And I can see that one of our attendees has got the hand raised. So Doug, just drop us a quick note if there's something that you'd like to ask. But yeah, one more. So very, very high level. What is the commercial model and how is the price calculated? EPS, stroke number of endpoints, etc., etc. So yeah, how do we calculate the commercials, Chuck?
Great question. So we set out, because of my 2 decades as a CISO, managing 9-figure budgets for years and years. I hate variances, and I don't want to inflict variances on our customers. So our licensing model is very simple, and it's based on monthly API volume, which is the same thing as events per second. If you break it down, it's just how many API calls and responses do you get, and we sell those in buckets of 50 million. So the pricing is very predictable. I don't care how many APIs you have. I don't care how many users you have. We don't charge for the code reviews by instance or anything like that. We keep the model very, very simple. And what drives our cost is traffic. The more traffic we have, the more bandwidth, storage, and the more CPU we have to use for our analysis. And we try to keep that as simple as possible. If you have more traffic, it costs everybody more. If you have less traffic, it costs everybody less. And typically what we'll do is let's say that we have a customer with a $100 million license, or 100 million, not dollar, 100 million calls per month license. If we see them going above that, we will start to notify them that, hey, we're noticing, higher than usual utilization, which is great, means your API adoption is going well, your volumes are increasing. Next renewal cycle, we'll true that up. So, we don't have to deal with month-to-month variances, but if your API adoption increases and usage increases, it costs everybody more to process. So we're very transparent, very simple, very easy to use. No month-to-month variances, no nickel and diming stuff. We're just we want to solve the security problem without creating disincentive to use us by every time we add a new API, it's going to cost you another $10,000. Like that's not a sustainable operating model. We want to keep the licensing very simple so we don't create disincentive to cover your whole environment.
Perfect. So Chuck, one's just come in. And it goes back to the compliance piece that we touched on within the deck. But in terms of standards, does Wib conform to PCI DSS for pen testing and follow the NIST cyber matrix for risk scoring?
We do. So for PCI, we are not a QSA. We have no desire to be a QSA, but we can absolutely work with your QSA to perform pen tests, web app and API pen tests that will satisfy the PCI requirements under Section 11. And what was the second question, Stu?
The second part of the question was, sorry, I just moved it across. And follow the NIST cybermatics for risk scoring.
Yes, we support NIST, and actually, when in a product demo, we can show you the way that we break down the risk in terms that map to multiple frameworks. So NIST, ISO, and others, where identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, confidentiality, integrity, availability. All of these things are in standard sort of languages and formats so that they're easy to translate across jurisdictions. So for whatever reason in the US, we don't normally use ISO very much. The rest of the world is much more popular, but we can map to any of those. That's not a problem. But fundamentally, we're based on NIST. That's the basis of the reporting.
Fantastic. So I think that is all the questions in terms of the platform, the marketing, etc. There's been a couple of questions in whether or not we can share the deck afterwards, and of course we will do that. And a specific question in terms of the case studies as well. And can we share some further ones? So I know we've got additional ones in the deck, but certainly we can share those with you. But as Chuck said during the session, if there are any specific verticals that you focus on, or some of your customers where maybe we have some specifics that we can share, guide us in that way as well. But I think for now, we'll close off on the Q&A session. There's been some great questions in there, and probably one of the most interactive webinars I've been involved in. If we can just go to the last slide, Chuck, and the contact details will be on there in terms of as the next follow-up. So please do contact myself, Stuart Nairn Clark over at Kite, or our sales team. My details are up there, and also telephone number. Give me a shout for any questions you may have, and we can engage you with the Wib team to support you as partners and your end users in their journey around API security. But for me, thank you very much for taking the time, and I look forward to following up with you. Thank you, Chuck.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it, and thank you for attending today. I hope you learned something, and I hope it was a useful session. So thank you for having me.